I really want to talk about journalism and whether there is still a point to journalism, real reporting, and also what is the role for you, for audiences, particularly young audiences, as to whether you think there is a need to still have real reporting in life. Because what exactly does journalism do? What does credible journalism do? So I'd like to explore this and also see what can we do if we do believe that real journalism is needed. What can we do to save it? Things have changed a great deal. I'm often called a dinosaur because I represent the work of being a foreign correspondent for many years. And do we still have a role today? But I do want to look a bit as to why I became a journalist, and particularly for young people, because I'm often asked this question: why did you do it? How did you do it? And what is the role of journalism? Now, in many ways, I wanted to become a journalist from a very early age. I loved writing, and I believed that journalism, reporting, could make a difference in life, could make a difference in the way people think, could make a difference in the way governments operate or don't operate. And this is perhaps a bit naive, but in many ways I still think the same thing, and I don't think it's naive. But why did I become a journalist? Like many of you who've gone to the international schools in Switzerland, we're very privileged here in Switzerland. We have access to different languages. We have access to different cultures. We go to school with kids who come from different parts of the world. But as with a lot of young Americans, and I say this, obviously my accent is not American, but I did go to Paris after university in order to become Hemingway. I think if any of you have not read Hemingway, I do think you should, because he's very much a young person's author. He felt very strongly about the honest word. And if you really want to cheat, you can watch Midnight in Paris, and there is a Hemingway character in the film who goes on and on about the honest word, about the truthful word. Also, Hemingway did have an adage of a journalist is someone who has to be able to sup or dine with beggars and kings. That means you have got to be able to sit down and talk with anyone in a language that they can understand, and then of course your job is then to communicate what has been said, but you need to have access to all these different sources. Now, I didn't become Hemingway, obviously. I did grow a beard. This actually is a shot from Afghanistan with Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was this extraordinary commander, resistance commander, who was very sadly killed several days before 9/11 in 2001. And I was actually up there to see him. He didn't turn up. I left 2 days early because my wife's birthday is on September 13, and I had to get back. And I told the Afghans, I can't wait for Massoud because I can face the Taliban, but I cannot face my wife if I miss her birthday. So one of the things, of course, we did, all the journalists and the aid workers, in order to look like Afghans, we all grew beards. Of course, none of us looked like an Afghan, but we felt quite good about it. And it did help me at least to get a bit closer to Hemingway, because once in Paris, I went to the Ritz Hotel to see a friend of mine at the coffee shop. And I turned up at the Ritz, and I was walking in, and the receptionist said, "Excuse me, you have to go over there." And I said, no, I'm meeting someone in the coffee lounge. And they said, no, you have to go there. So I went to what is known as the Hemingway Bar, and I walked in, and there were about 100 men, all between 40 and 70, 80, all with beards and all looking like Hemingway. And it was the Hemingway lookalike contest. So at least I got there. But what are reporters? What are foreign correspondents supposed to do? Now again, to sound a bit like the dinosaur, I do want to remind you that the role of the foreign correspondent is and was to report. Looking at today, we had a golden age in a way of the foreign correspondent, which is not happening today. you would go out to different countries. For example, the major newspapers, TVs, radios would have correspondents based in Nairobi, in Johannesburg, in Delhi. But unfortunately, those days are more or less over because it's too costly, and many media are simply not willing to invest in this sort of reporting. The reason why I think we need to get back to having foreign correspondents is because you are on the spot. Now, of course, you can argue, well, I live in London, or I live in Paris, in New York, and I can parachute in. That's not the same thing. What happens when you're on the spot is that you have your local contacts. You talk to people. Very often, they may be aid workers. And during the 80s, 90s, leading up into the 2000s, you would have your network of aid workers, of diplomats, of other journalists. You exchanged information. Yes, there was competition between the journalists, but we all helped each other. You were in Mogadishu, in Somalia, one day. You might the next day be in Colombo, in Sri Lanka, or in Kabul, in Afghanistan. And you would bump into the same people, and you would have a reputation. The aid workers would say, oh, you can trust so-and-so of the New York Times, or of The Guardian, because they understand what goes on the ground. And they won't misuse this information. There was a degree of trust. And the same with the diplomats. With the people parachuted in, very often they arrive, they're expected to start reporting within 30 seconds, literally. And I remember seeing a report during the first Gulf War, or the second, I can't remember which, where CNN had a camera set up. And the correspondent was actually saying, well, I'm not quite sure what's happening over there, but it looks like, and he went on like this for 1 hour. And my immediate thought was, switch off the bloody camera, get over there and find out what's going on, and then come back and report. It's not entertainment, which unfortunately a lot of it is. So what's the point of becoming a journalist? Now, I had an enormous advantage. I had a job which, for me, I thought was the best job in the world. And I often thought that, what I should do in my second life, I could become a doctor, but I always felt that in my third life, I'll become a journalist again. Because you were paid to do the sort of travel that anyone would love, or I imagine anyone would love to do. So I spent, before I was married, I spent 8 months a year traveling to Mozambique, Angola, all over the world, unfortunately covering a lot of conflicts, and also meeting some characters, such as this gentleman here, bin Laden, who I met twice actually toward the end of the 1980s in Afghanistan. That's a whole different story, which I won't get into. But the fact is, that is also what journalism is about. You would meet people who had murdered friends of yours, but you have to, as a journalist, it is your job to talk to them, no matter how uncomfortable this might be, because your job is to report, your job is to present a sense of what is happening on the ground, so that when people back home can read about it, can watch it on television, and it really doesn't matter whether you read it on an iPad or a mobile phone or in a newspaper or in a magazine. What matters is the content that you can trust. So, can this still happen today? Unfortunately, no. There are very, very few media that are reinvesting in journalism. The Washington Post actually is, obviously The Guardian, the New York Times. They are reinvesting. They have realized there is a crucial importance of having reporting that not only can you use, but actually informs you whether you like it or not. Because the whole point of journalism, on-the-ground journalism, is to enable you as a reader, as a viewer, as an audience, to understand and to make informed decisions, right or wrong, but at least to make informed decisions about what is happening in certain countries and places or situations. When you arrive in a place, my editor at the Christian Science Monitor newspaper in the States used to ring me and say, Ed, isn't it time you went back to the Horn of Africa? There was no particular news story happening at the time, but he felt it was important that we cover it. We provide a certain consistency. You go back again and again and again, and you report so that you would provide the sort of necessary background, you would nurture your contacts, and you would be able to provide the on-the-ground reporting that is absolutely crucial and that is sadly not happening in many places. So we have all these different things, troll farms in Russia, I'm sure you've heard about, manipulating information, social media, what is true, what isn't. And then, again, the point of storytelling. I believe very strongly in storytelling, and I use that in a journalistic sense, meaning that if you cannot convey a story, if you cannot convey a sense of what is happening in Mozambique, or what is happening in Iraq, or today, very sadly, in Yemen, then you're not doing your job. And we need this sort of information. So who are we relying on? And what sort of storytelling will actually convey? Because we're trying to reach the Swiss banker, we're trying to reach the student at the TEDxHautLacSchool school, we're trying to reach everyone, but they need to be informed in a manner that is accessible and that they understand. And usually storytelling based on facts is actually a very good way of doing it. So who do we trust today? One thing which I notice is that before I used to think journalists were pretty much at the lowest end of the spectrum, and then I found when I went to the States and did a fellowship at Yale Law School that lawyers were even slightly below journalists, and I think now we can all rest assured that politicians are really at the rock bottom. But who do we trust? Fox News? For me, Fox News or Fox Television has nothing to do with journalism. I think Goebbels will be extremely impressed with Fox News. But I think we have to ask these questions. Who do we trust? Even the BBC is changing. I listen to the BBC. I am a great fan of the BBC. However, its website for me has now become almost unreadable. It's become the Daily Mail. If you want to read the Daily Mail, you read the Daily Mail. I want to read the BBC. It's not, that is changing, and there is this pressure of always reaching the lowest common denominator. So let's take very quickly some examples. In the States, during the Trump election, I think we journalists failed. We failed because we did not realize that America is not one country. America is many Americas. We should be covering America the way we cover Africa or Asia, realizing there are many different groups of people, there are many different countries, and we didn't do that. We equated America with being Washington or New York or California, but it's not Idaho, it's not Kansas. The same thing with Brexit. Brexit, I think, was based largely on lies, disinformation. It was not democracy. It's being pandered as democracy today. I think it failed at democracy. If you want to see a professional and credible referendum, you come to Switzerland. In Switzerland, they have referenda every 3 months. And boy, you are informed about the issue, pro and against, in the documents that you receive. And you are expected as a citizen, even though the voting rate doesn't often go above 50%, but you are expected to inform yourself, and you have the opportunity to inform yourself. To simply put out a piece of paper saying yes or no, or remain or leave, that is not democracy, that is not a referendum. Very quickly, I live in a village in France. There's a lot of destruction of local cultural heritage. 17th, 18th, 19th century buildings. No one is reporting about it. I reported about it. I wrote a big piece in the Sunday Times. Of course, the Sunday Times editor was delighted to run a piece which showed that the French were destroying their own culture. But the whole point is that you need reporting, to local reporting, not just international, to keep the local politicians, or the property developers, or whoever they are, people have to be informed. And that's not happening in France. There are a lot of laws that constrain freedom of speech, that constrain free reporting, which I think President Macron now appears to be looking at. And then, of course, who's covering the rest of the world? Who's covering the Yemens of today? There are 7 million people under threat, in danger. There are no good people in Yemen amongst the players. They're all pretty nasty, but the fact is, once again, civilians are the ones who are struggling to survive. So who's going to do that sort of reporting? And can we afford not to be informed? This is what you have to ask yourselves, and I have to ask myself. Can we afford not to be informed, particularly in this day of age where it's acceptable for an American president to lie through his teeth? And I think there's enough to indicate that it's true. Also, social media is simply a platform. It's not journalism. Who is providing the content? If you write blogs, is that really content? No, it isn't. It's needs to be based on reporting and on factual truth. So where do you, particularly the young people, where do you get your information from, and what do you believe in? What are your sources? We did actually a little mini-survey here through the OLAC, but also people elsewhere answered. And the interesting thing is that really most of the people, the students who answered, mainly 16, 17 years old, felt that they had access to good information. Most of them said they relied on journalism, and also whether the information came through their friends and teachers or parents, it didn't matter. Interesting too, not too good news for the print newspapers, but certainly still a willingness to read what is online, and also the fact that over 90% said that they would be willing, either now or later in life, presumably when they have jobs, to actually pay for journalism, which is what we need to do. So, and can we afford not to have real journalism? I think democracy is a danger if we don't have it. So we have to ask very quickly, how can we do it? And I think there are ways of doing it. We have what are known as the Global Compact companies, nearly 10,000 of them, but 12,000 members of the Global Compact group. A lot of them are actually working in sustainable development. They're providing support. They also need to provide support for journalism, because who is going to inform credibly about what is happening? You can have all these wonderful sayings, but is it PR, or is it really talking about what is needed? So why not have a global fund for public interest reporting, which goes out as grants to journalists all over the world, and once the money is contributed, whether it's from tobacco companies or from Nestle or whatever, it doesn't matter. Once it's in there, you have no say over where it goes. It goes to public interest journalism. And very finally, I do want to say that the journalists here who've been talking about what we do in life as journalists, we may be dinosaurs, we have a lot of experience behind our belts, under our belts, but we can help. However, I think it really is up to young people to bring about the change that is needed. And it's not going to happen without you. It's your world now, and you are the generation that can make it count, and I think you need to make a demand. I just wanted my parting shot, I just want to throw this in. This was a poem that was given to me actually when I was a student. I was hitchhiking from London to Nottingham, and with some new age people driving a Rolls Royce, and as I got out, they gave me this poem of Princes and Kings. Isn't it strange how princes and kings and clowns that caper in sawdust rings and common people like you and me are builders for eternity? Each is given a list of rules, a shapeless mass, a bag of tools, and each must fashion, ere life is flown, a stumbling block or a stepping stone. And this applies to journalism, and it applies to life. Thank you.